All right, everyone. Good morning and welcome to today's TTA session for our state formula grants for federal fiscal year 25. This is a new or recompete session. If you're not quite sure, if you're a current subgrantee of Serve Washington and you're not quite sure if you're in the right session, or what status you are in your grant cycle, please feel free to check in with your program officer at any time and we will confirm or redirect you. Next slide. All right, so a few of the housekeeping items we've already gone over signing in. We have our agenda here. I want to preface this session with acknowledging the executive orders that are coming at us in a very rapid pace. And so we have, to the best of our ability, updated the RFGA in terms of what we know of the executive orders at this time, and I will go into more detail with that. I want to also acknowledge that AmeriCorps, at least as of this morning, had not sent out any instructions regarding formula grant making to state commissions. So rather than withhold the RFGA and continue to delay that process, we internally decided to go ahead and release the RFGA, going off the best due dates that we know at this time. So again, I can go into further detail with that later in this presentation and answer questions if needed. Next slide. Here's a quick snapshot of national service in Washington. I did double check just yesterday, and this is the most updated number. So you will see that we have several hundred local service sites, thousands of AmeriCorps senior and AmeriCorps members who have served in this state, and then you'll see the financial numbers in terms of funding that we have received. AmeriCorps funding, it brings people together to tackle pressing challenges through national service. AmeriCorps helps make service a cornerstone of our national culture. AmeriCorps can sometimes feel overwhelming to people who have not heard of AmeriCorps as a federal agency or really understand everything it encompasses. There are several layers to national service and managing an AmeriCorps program. So I highly suggest that you do as much digging in, looking at the AmeriCorps.gov website and checking to see what we're doing around the state here in Washington. We do host a competitive funding session in the fall. You are now in formula funding. Formula funding is really focused on smaller programs, whereas oftentimes competitive funding, we're looking for a minimum of 20 MSYs. We oftentimes have programs that have several hundred MSYs. For those of you not familiar, MSY is an acronym for member service year. So it sometimes is per individual and sometimes one MSY can encompass several different AmeriCorps members. The focus is to meet local priorities with a single or multiple focus areas and really building that evidence base. These are the historic focus areas. Again, I have worked to the best of my knowledge to remove language that could potentially, possibly be seen as a violation of the executive orders that are coming at us. And then I'll go into our local focus areas. So here's what we have updated as of this month. Again, if we go off the federal NOFO that was released, there were words that were in there that may imply we are not following the current executive orders. There is still a lot to be said in terms of what the buzzwords are. What I will do is put in the chat what I know to be the potential list of buzzwords as of today. So if you have received AmeriCorps funding before, or you're looking to obtain AmeriCorps funding for the first time, as we know it today, those are some key words and phrases that you would want to redact, omit, or not include in your grant application in order to comply with the executive orders that have been bestowed upon us and as of what we know today. Next slide. Here's some more regarding our priority funding areas in the state of Washington. So you will see a lot of wording around community, some career pathways. We are not going to remove any language regarding recruiting members that reflect those communities that you serve, as I don't see it as a violation of any of those quote unquote buzzwords as written in executive orders and in terms of guidance that we have received thus far. Next slide. A brief snapshot of what AmeriCorps members do and their restrictions around that. So they would engage in direct service with a minimum of 70% of their time being dedicated towards that. Now, there is a maximum 20% training time, and this would be for the entirety of their service year. So if they're serving 1,700 hours, no more than 20% of that can go towards training and 10% can go towards fundraising. However, there has been an updated rule. So as of October 1st, you can actually exceed that 20% training if it is for an apprenticeship program, job training and readiness program, an activity to support obtaining a GED. Now, I realize that language is pretty vague. That is what the federal agency defines it as. So I would suggest if you think that you potentially have a program or a program design in mind where your members would qualify under this to have more than 20% training in their total service hours, definitely speak with your program officer and we'll take the conversation from there. I think that this will be a unique set of circumstances and we'll have to address it individually as a program. Do not
Diane,
duplicate. Yes.
just want to call attention. We have a lot of programs that aren't currently in our portfolio and they don't have assigned program officers. So,
Oh, thank you. Yes, so if you are writing your grant application and you have questions around this, we will have contact information at the end of this slideshow where you can submit those questions to our general inbox. And it is important that you send the email to that general email address and we will respond accordingly. Thank you, Thomas. The next bullet point talks about duplication or displacement. So what that would really look like if you are managing an AmeriCorps program would be you would not want to bring on AmeriCorps members to do exactly what the organization or agency that you're partnering with is already doing. So if you're partnering with a school district and they have recently terminated, displaced paraeducators, what we don't want to do with AmeriCorps members is have them go in and fill that work that has recently been displaced. So that would look a lot of different ways depending on what type of program you are managing. But the best guidance would be to create service activities that are unique within itself, that you are not displacing already employed individuals with that agency. Additionally, it's really important to remember that AmeriCorps members are not employees. That's why we will often refer to them as members. They are not working. I'm going to go ahead and mute someone. They are not employees and we don't refer to them as working. So you will hear the term serving, maybe even volunteering. You will not hear the word pay or paycheck. You will hear living stipend. Next slide. All right, and then I will have Thomas speak to this slide, please.
yeah, so there are two types of grants, cost reimbursement and fixed. Most of you on this call will be going for cost reimbursement. So in order to create your budget narrative, there's a form that you follow, but in the narrative part of that, you need to put all the calculations used to create the budget amount that you're coming up with for each category, for each line item. So if you're going to round, you need to be very transparent about how you're rounding it. And in all likelihood, you're going to start ending up with weird dollar amounts because of the type of calculations that you make. That's perfectly normal. So you want to make sure that your calculations are accurate that you put in there. And all of this is kind of prose that you put in. So you have to kind of check your calculations on the side. So, if you look at this example for staff travel, what you'll end up putting in the numbers section is 1186, but in the narrative, you need to break it down to airfare, ground transportation, lodging, per diem, all that stuff. And then registration fees are actually a different category. They don't belong in travel, they belong in training. So that's the kind of stuff that you need to get right when you're doing your budget narrative. It's not that complicated, but it's also not that straightforward. You're going to have to itemize each category, which is to say, when it comes to salary and fringe, you need to break it down into each person, each role that you're putting on the grant. If it's travel, it's different, every different reason that you're traveling. So you don't have to break it down to every single trip, but if there's a category of trips, they need to be separate from another category of trips. So if you're doing site visits, that's one category, whereas travel to like meetings is another category. Travel to trainings is another category, right? Yeah, so we can get to the next slide. So we have something that is new this year, personnel guidelines. We've noticed trends and we've noticed some difficulty coming up with this on programs' behalf. So these are our guidelines. 0.5 to 1.5 staff FTE per 10 MSY. One staff should be at least half an FTE usage on grant. No staff at less than 20% usage. You're kind of getting into an area where you're talking about an indirect employee at that point. Any staff at 50% usage or more should be located in Washington. It just kind of makes sense that, if you're doing most of your work on the Washington grant, you should be located in Washington and we should have access to you. If these conditions can't be met, just include a justification for why you need to go outside of these guidelines with your application, and maybe discuss it with your program officer if you need a little more guidance than that. All right, next slide. All right. Now, in the nuts and bolts of the budget, if you change a line item in section 1 or 2, which is your operations and your member costs, section 3, which is your indirect rate, is going to need to be updated. This is one of those things that is kind of a pain to constantly recalculate, but that's what we're dealing with. In terms of indirect cost rate, do you have a federally approved indirect cost rate as an organization? that's what you should use. There is a de minimis indirect rate. That indirect rate is now 15%. So we have an option that I would recommend, which is the corporation fixed 5%, 10% option. If you don't have any federally approved indirect rate as of yet, this is kind of a non-committal way to capture that on your grant. If you choose instead to use a de minimis rate, once you use it on a federal grant, which this would be, you'll be expected to use it on all federal grants. So keep that in mind. There's also some other limitations on the de minimis. You're supposed to use a modified direct costs instead of just all direct costs. So overall, you might find it most beneficial to use the de minimis. I would recommend you use the corporation fixed rate unless you already have a federal rate. The source of funds section is important and easy to skip, but don't skip it, and it should equal your match. Make sure that you're including like fingerprinting and background check costs when you're putting your budget narrative together. For fixed amount grants, it's a lot simpler. Need to follow the instructions to use the allowance rate column. List member slots under members without living allowance. It's a strange quirk. Be transparent with your MSY calculations. And again, don't forget your source of funds. You don't actually have a match, but you do have other revenues. So you should match your demographics section with your budget. Any questions on filling out the budget part of the application? All right, probably move on.
All right, thanks, Thomas. All right, so going back to eligible applicants, we would expect that you would be hosting roughly 10 to 30 MSY. So we really don't want to take on new applications hosting less than that. If you are interested in opportunities where you're wanting to host maybe 1 or 2 AmeriCorps members, we would love to have a conversation with you because that may be an opportunity for you to partner with one of our other subgrantees that actually is within a state agency. And then the service would begin no earlier than August 1st of this year and no later than January 1st of 2026. So you'll see that list of eligible entities, which includes state and local governments, nonprofits, etc. You would want to be sure that you have a UEI number, EIN, and that your SAM registration is up to date prior to you submitting your AmeriCorps application. If you don't have a SAM registration, it would be the time to get one before you fully submit your application. Next slide. And then here's just kind of a visual of the RFGA process. So with our formula grant making that we're doing right now, obviously you would submit your grant in eGrants. I want to take a pause here to mention that due to what is currently happening with the executive orders, our grants in the eGrant system have been placed kind of on a hold/amendment status. Without going too far in the weeds with that, we have been asked to update our current language and our current grants that we're actually operating in at this time. And so due to those amendments happening in the grant system, we cannot open up our current application. So for most or all of you, actually, I've been told as of this morning, if you were to go in and start your new application as you normally would during this formula grant making process, you should not have the opportunity to do so. And that is simply because AmeriCorps is waiting for us to respond to their directions they gave to us as of Friday, February 14th, that we need to remove all language as they have found to be not a compliance of current executive orders with the Trump-Vance administration. That being said, you still have the opportunity to work on your grant to the side. In fact, we would actually recommend that anyways. And there is a budget worksheet on our Serve Washington website. So I highly recommend the Hold Up in eGrants does not stop you from starting your application process, because when those applications are open and ready, it could simply be a copy and paste into the eGrants application, which again, we recommend every year anyways. So I just wanted to speak to that as we're going through this visual. So once your application was submitted, our commission reviews and votes. It's presented to the grant review committee. They provide recommendation. The Board of Commissioners votes. There are clarification periods built in within this. So if you made a mistake, or we have a question on your budget, or you missed a section, this allows us time to communicate back and forth with you to get those corrections taken care of before final submission. And then once those awards are made, that's when the fun happens. You get your program and you start recruiting members to help your organization. Next slide. So here's the timeline that we actually had embedded in the RFGA. Sorry, I skipped over the acronym earlier, but RFGA is request for grant applications, and that is what Serve Washington has posted on our website. So right now, obviously, you are in the technical assistance Zoom, and then you will see the timeline from there. Now, what is impacted are those last two TBD dates, and that is again because AmeriCorps has yet to send out their instructions to commissions. That includes a due date as to when we would need to have everything turned around and sent to the federal agency. And we also don't have a date in terms of when we will receive our allocated funds from the federal agency. So there isn't a chance, and I just want to put this out there, that some of these dates that you see currently listed may be extended. They will not be changed to be any sooner. I can confirm that, but we may be able to extend more time to get applications in. We just don't know what that would look like right now. So we wanted to base our due dates based on previous year submissions and then go from there. The TBD is very unique to this year and has to do with the climate currently with the federal agency. Next slide. Here's a little bit more about the acronyms you've already heard us say. So NOFO, competitive versus formula, the difference between cost reimbursement and fixed, and then where you would be in the 3-year grant cycle. Next slide. All right, so some key highlights. There is that email address. So if you have additional documents you need to send in, you would send those as an attachment to our general inbox, which is servewa@ofm.wa.gov. All of this information is also clearly written in your RFGA. And then, as I mentioned earlier, due to current amendments in eGrants, you may not have access to your application. I will update our RFGA as best as possible once we do receive that guidance from the federal agency. Again, those due dates are subject to change. And then just a notation that we have not received those instructions as expected. I believe those instructions typically go out in January, for perspective. Next slide. And then some notes on page limits, narratives. Again, keep in mind when writing your narratives of those words that I put in the chat, the maximum cost per MSY, the living allowance. You'll need to pay special mind to that when building your budget. And then as Thomas mentioned, you will budget for those criminal history checks, and those costs have not changed in comparison to previous years if you've already hosted an AmeriCorps program before. But you'll want to be sure that you budget for every AmeriCorps member in your program, and probably then some, because there's a high chance that you could run criminal history checks on members that don't actually start with you. So I would overestimate on that. And you would also want to run criminal history checks on any staff charging time to the grant. You'll want to pay special attention to prohibited and unallowable activities. And as you're building out your program, ensure that you would not ask members to participate in those activities. Next slide. And then here's a little bit about our review criteria. So you will see the point system and where much of the decision bearing is weighted on, which is program design. But I would definitely take note of, all the other sections as well. They all have point value when doing our internal review as well as with the grant review committee. Next slide. All right, and then I'm going to pass it to Lou Thompson to talk about theory of change.
All right, thanks, Diane. Yes, I'm Lou Thompson with Serve Washington, and we want to take this opportunity to highlight a broader topic. So AmeriCorps' definition of theory of change, which now encompasses a few different sections. So that community section, the evidence section, and then the logic model really will all describe what AmeriCorps calls a theory of change. So there are three basic elements: that problem need statement, the evidence-based intervention, and then the intended outcome. An aligned theory of change has an assumed cause and effect relationship. So let's talk about each element. So the community problem, this is captured in the narrative section. It is where you will talk about the condition that exists in the service area that you are proposing, and the need explains what the scope, the significance, and cause of any community problem is. So the problem need statement would answer questions like, who's affected, how many, how severe, and it answers the question, so what? What would likely happen if nothing is done? And finally, you would also try to describe, why does this problem exist? How is it perpetuated? And we encourage you to use as many reputable, current, and local statistics and data sources as you can find that's relevant to what you're planning to address in your community. So you would provide a detailed summary face of what's going on with the underserved population that might be contributing to the problem. And a word of caution here about really lengthy problem statements outlining every possible negative condition in a service area, even if it's irrelevant to your program. So just a word of caution not to do that. Next would be the intervention. So this is the set of activities that you believe will produce the intended outcome of your program. And it's important to clearly define each aspect of the intervention. Don't assume that the reader understands your intentions, especially if you're using really general or common interventions like tutoring or mentoring. So we want to know what's the design and the dosage. So that would be who does what with whom, how often, how many times, for what proposed length of time. So the frequency, intensity, and duration, that's what your dosage is. And we want to know each of those specific things. So a word of caution here about interventions that are defined in general terms, but lack detail or supportive evidence. Finally is the intended outcome, and that is the change that you hope to see. So the change could be a change in behavior, in attitude, knowledge, skill, condition. Those are the types of changes we're wanting to know about. And here a word of caution about outcomes that could be really difficult to measure or that perhaps don't align with your proposed intervention or the need that you're describing. So let's talk a little bit about the logic model. The logic model should capture your program's theory of change. It has been expanded in recent years to allow for a maximum of 8 pages. It used to be much shorter, so you have a lot more space now in the logic model section. Still, because it's these very narrow columns, we do suggest using bullet points or short phrases rather than full sentences in your logic model. Basically, when read left to right, the logic model answers the question if then. So an example I have on the slide is if we have 20 AmeriCorps members, then 400 students will receive services, and on throughout the chart. You could also read it backwards, right to left, and then it would answer the question, but how? So if 400 students need services, that would require 20 AmeriCorps members, as just an example. So the logic model encompasses short, medium, and long-term outcomes. This could represent time or conditional change. So think ABC, attitude, behavior, condition. It's important to note that not all of the outcomes require an associated performance measure. So the logic model should capture your full theory of change, all that your program is proposing to do. And then your program may choose to only measure one of the outputs with one aligned, usually short-term outcome. Longer-term outcomes that you describe in your logic model might be more relevant for a future program evaluation, or may simply represent an ultimate change in condition established through cause and effect, but it's not necessarily within your program's means to measure in 1 year, and we don't expect you to. So choose whatever makes the most sense for your program. It all depends on your program's design, but just know that you're not required to develop performance measures for all of the outputs and outcomes that you are describing in your logic model. The logic model really should read like a story or blueprint of your program, and we are looking for alignment throughout from column to column. The reader really should be able to envision a day in the life of your program. Another part of the overall theory of change is the evidence, and it has its own section in the narrative. So the level of evidence in support of the intervention increases the likelihood of a cause and effect relationship in your theory of change. So the RFGA and mandatory supplemental instructions outline a spectrum of evidence, and we encourage the use of evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions. We also know that not all program designs will fall into the moderate or strong evidence as defined by AmeriCorps. That's totally okay. AmeriCorps acknowledges many currently funded applications fall all across the spectrum, and I would say most of our formula programs are in the pre-preliminary stages of evidence, and that is okay. So just a little more on the evidence section. Again, please reference the RFGA and mandatory supplemental instructions. But in the narrative section, applicants should, 1, describe your program and its impact on the proposed community being served, and 2, propose how your program design is evidence-based or evidence-informed. This means describing any evidence that supports the proposed program design, including past performance data of your own program or other research findings. And you would describe that all directly in the narrative section. So the level of evidence or evidence tier is defined in the mandatory supplemental instructions. There are 4 different tiers: pre-preliminary, preliminary, moderate, and strong. And 3 of those, the preliminary, moderate, and strong, allow for additional submissions of hard copy evaluations beyond what you're putting in the narrative. So you could submit some additional reports, but those in the pre-preliminary category, if you believe that's where you fall, you would just use the narrative section to describe any evaluations, research, or data within that narrative section. And if you do believe you qualify for the preliminary, moderate, or strong, then you would only submit evaluation reports that reflect the exact same intervention and program design as the program that you're proposing, and only up to 2 reports. However, if you are recompeting and required to submit an evaluation based on evaluation requirements separate from the evidence requirements, you should still submit that evaluation report. So ultimately, you could end up submitting up to 3 reports total. That could get confusing. If you have any questions, email us at the email that Diane will share at the end. Let's talk a little bit about performance measures now and the performance measure module. So as I mentioned before, when talking about the logic model, all applications need to include at least 1 aligned performance measure. So that's 1 output and 1 outcome that are related to one another, and that correspond to your proposed primary intervention. This could be a national performance measure, or it could be what we call an applicant determined measure. And so you would use an applicant determined measure if you look over the national performance measures and you feel like none of those accurately capture your program's intervention. Then you can create your own applicant determined measure. That's totally fine. So performance measures reflecting activities that are not central to your program model should not be included in your application, and they don't need to be reported to us or AmeriCorps, although you might still collect some of the data for your own purposes. So using our previous logic model example, this is what a program might choose for their performance measure. So an output of 400 students served, and of those 400 students, let's say we expect at least 275 will improve math scores by 10% or greater. So that could be a performance measure that you decide to pull out from your logic model. A common pitfall we see are really lengthy problem statements in the performance measurement section, as well as really long paragraphs under some of the other sections, like the described instrument section. So just note that the problem statement there can be a quick 2 to 3 sentence summary. And I have an example on this slide. So likewise, the described instrument section, try to keep it as brief as possible, but we also recognize we're asking for a lot of information in that space. So for your outcome performance measures described instrument statement, you do need to specify who's counted. For example, only those who complete the full dosage. And then you are needing to explain the change required between pre and post to be counted, and indicate how this change is meaningful or significant. I have an example because I often see statements that are much, much, much longer than this. And so to try to be as concise as you can. Let's see, and I will just quickly talk a little bit about the evaluation plan and report. So if you are recompeting, so that's for folks who have already had an AmeriCorps grant for one full 3-year cycle, then you would also submit an evaluation plan. We do have a template provided. It's on our website with our other grant materials. And it is a template from AmeriCorps that we use. Some of the sections might not be applicable. Just review those. If you feel like it doesn't apply to you, it's fine to write NA and then skip it. And then for recompete applicants, these are people who have gone through 2 full cycles. So you've had 6 years of AmeriCorps funding. You would then submit a new evaluation plan as well as an evaluation report that you completed during the previous 3-year cycle. We don't have a specific template that you're required to use for the evaluation report, but generally you can still follow the sections of the evaluation plan. AmeriCorps also has a training that I've linked to, and I think they have kind of a basic template or sections that could be a really great option for what to follow. Let's see, and I think that's it, and I will pass it back over to Diane.
All right, thanks so much, Lou. Again, if you have questions about anything that I discussed or Thomas discussed today, along with Lou with the evaluation pieces, please feel free to send an email to that general email, and we will definitely route it to the correct person and make sure that you receive a response. We did put in the RFGA that we would prefer that questions not continue to come in within a week of that deadline. So if we stick to the deadline of March 28th for application submission, you would want to get any application related questions to us, hopefully by March 21st. And then here is a list of the additional documents that you may be sending in. Next slide. Some more tips with eGrants, which I know I mentioned earlier, you most likely can't even access your application in eGrants right now, but once you do gain access to that, here's some really helpful tips. I know it's really easy for the reader / evaluator to delineate between sections if you use all caps for your section headings, so highly recommend that. eGrants automatically does double space, so pay attention to your page limits when it comes to that. And make sure that you pay close attention, as many, if not all of you, will be transferring all your information over from Word into eGrants. Chrome is definitely your best browser when navigating eGrants. Next slide. A few more application tips. You can read the NOFO as it applies to FY25. Do not use web addresses in your narrative. Make sure that your numbers match in all sections. So for example, if you are writing in your narrative that you propose to host 25 AmeriCorps members, please be sure that your budget also reflects that as well. Be accurate on your face sheet. Make sure that you have updated all of your authorized representatives. We see often where there are previous staff listed in eGrants as authorized reps or part of the eGrants application that are no longer with the organization. So if you already do have an eGrants account, please make sure that all of that contact information is updated. And then keep in mind that your project date is 1 full calendar year. So for example, your project date may be August 1st through July 31st. So it may begin August 1st, 2025 through July 31st, 2026. However, your members may only serve 10 months out of that 12-month cycle, or your project may be September through August, and your members are only serving September 3rd, or 5th after Labor Day through June 30th. So just keep in mind that the project date is not the same as the member service date, where they would be earning their service hours towards their Siegel Education Award. Always print your review, always have an impartial reviewer read it through. Several sets of eyes is better than one. This time can be overwhelming and stressful when you're reading through over and over again. So definitely give yourself an early deadline and try to get as many eyes on it as possible before that final submission. Next slide. And then we have our readiness assessment on our website, as well as our RFGA is listed. If you have trouble finding that, or you have any questions about it, again, here's that same email address. Feel free to reach out anytime. We are monitoring that every day during the week. So we will definitely strive to get back to you as quickly as possible. And then I wanted to open it up for any questions that anyone might have. We understand that this is already really cumbersome and a lot of information to digest on top of everything happening at the federal agency right now. There is a lot of unknowns, so we've definitely shared what I know as of this morning, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'll give you a second if anybody wants to post anything in the chat as well. It should be 11 pages. So if it says 10 in the RFGA, which I think it might, I will update that, Bill. Thank you. Yeah, I'll make a note to update that. So we're following the FY25 NOFO that came from the feds, and that change was to 11 pages. Danny asked in the chat, clearly this program is not designed for very small organizations. You historically see several orgs band together to apply for 1 or 2 members in several different missions. So I have been with the commission since May of 2024. So I would actually ask if anyone else from Serve Washington on the call has a better answer to that than I might. Thomas, I saw you unmute.
So we have a program called Washington Service Corps, and typically when somebody only wants a really small number of members and it's not really enough for a program, they can apply to Washington Service Corps and see about joining that program. I have not seen what you're talking about, where several different organizations kind of come together. I think that would be an administrative nightmare to try and share a grant that way. Although one thing that you do see is you might have one organization have a program, and then they'll have partner sites that will have like 1 or 2 members each. So you could do it that way if you thought, for example, your program could handle a grant. Washington Service Corps, yes. And then you knew you had a few other partners that would be interested in getting members through that grant. That would be a possibility. But yeah, overall, I would recommend Washington Service Corps as the simpler route, unless you really had something robust in mind.
Danny, if you want to reach out to us, we're happy to connect you with the directors and program staff with Washington Service Corps. We refer a lot of people to them. All right, I want to give it a few more minutes for any other questions. If there aren't any other questions, I just want to remind everyone we will post the recording to our Serve Washington website, so you can access this and the slides later. And I will post updates to the RFGA as we get those due dates from AmeriCorps, the federal agency, and I will make that correction to the page limits. Thank you for pointing that out again. And again, we're available for questions. We want to see programs succeed. We want successful applications to come through. So we are here to support you. Just want to remind everyone, we don't know quite yet what our allocation will be, but we will know more as we receive that guidance from AmeriCorps. But thank you for your interest. Thank you for your time. And we hope to be hearing more from you and to see some of these applications come rolling in. I will stay on if anyone has anything else, but otherwise I will go ahead and stop the recording, Lou.